All right, advanced operating features. In this section, we're going to cover a couple things. We've already looked at some of these already, at least a little bit. We're going to talk about toolbar customization, some more information about your date fields, and then we're going to go into user preferences, as well as we'll have a pretty good discussion about work lists in the software. So first of all, toolbar customization. We've looked at this briefly already in some of the other sections, particularly on advanced reporting. If you open up any of your report screens, you can add toolbar buttons to what we've set as the designated set of toolbar buttons up on your main toolbar. Those include font, web page, Excel, save report as, and export. Primarily the one that I've seen the most used the most often is the save report as. This allows you to save it as a PDF file or export it to Excel really easily. Basically, you only really need to add the toolbar buttons that are most important for you. So I'm not going to go into these too much further. We've talked about what each of these buttons do in the other sessions. But for example, the font button, if you've added that to your main toolbar, allows you to easily control, again, the fonts that the software is using. So I can change it to a larger font for this report. This is only going to affect this one time that I run this report while I have this screen open. I can now preview the report, and it's used, again, my font settings. Again, this font caused a column wrap on this report, and so it's kind of hard to read. And so usually sticking with our basic fonts is going to be more useful for you. But you can certainly change font size for people or managers that want an easier font to read and things like that. Some of the fonts within the software can be small sometimes. Date fields can also be controlled a little bit more than what we've talked about already. The first option that you have for date fields is to change the format. Generally, this isn't something that you typically need to do. But if you prefer a different date format in some situations, you can control that. We use the management company window for that setting, and so it will be global for all users. But if you want to change that date format, you can. And one reason that you might do that, particularly for international users, would be to put the year first instead of month, day, year. Some people prefer the hyphens between their dates and prefer that to be the way that the dates are displayed. And that will affect how dates are displayed on the reports as well as in the windows. And so you can kind of change that across the board for anywhere you would see a date so that it matches your preferences for using the software. There's also quite an extended list of keyboard shortcuts for your dates. We talked already about your greater than, less than symbol to change the date one day at a time, one day less, or one day greater. Using the equal sign to always plug in today's date in that date field. Lowercase m, capital M, lowercase y, capital Y for changing to the beginning of the month and the end of the month. And also all of the brackets, the round brackets, the square brackets, and the curly brackets also will manipulate the dates as well. If you're commonly changing the dates the same way, learning some of those keyboard shortcuts can speed up your use of the program. You've noticed that you never have to type in the year. If I'm looking for just the first of the current year, all I have to type in is that even with a blank date, if I type in just the first, the month, and the day, it's going to assume the current year for that date. Or in the same way, if I just type in a two-digit year, 010108, it's going to assume that it's 2008. So you don't have to necessarily type all four digits of the year either. And the last two keyboard shortcuts, we can change a date 1 year less or 1 year greater with just the plus and minus signs. So minus signs will go 1 year less, and the plus signs will change just the year 1 year forward. Again, little things, but it can speed up the use and efficiency of the software. Also on date fields, we do have user preferences. Those user preferences are, again, in your user window. And if you have restricted access to the user window, you can allow access to the user preferences window for your securities, and that will allow users to set their own preferences, even though they may not have access to the user window itself. But either way, there's the Preferences tab for each user, which contains several things. It includes, like I was saying, the default date range options, which, as you've seen, as we bring up each report that has a date range, that date range is defaulting to the first of the current month and of the end of the current month. That can be really helpful. In most cases, that's what you're going to be using on your reports is the current date range. But if you have a manager that's using the software, they're always running reports for last month. They don't care yet about the current month. They'll audit that later. You might want to set that manager's user preferences to be the first of the last month and the end of the last month. And so you can choose the first of last month and the end of last month so that all of their reports are going to be defaulting to last month instead of this month. Again, lots of little things that just improve the efficiency of the software. And the other items that you can set on here are the startup toolbars, so that those toolbars open when they log into the software, or whichever toolbars you may want if you don't want them all. So all three of those things, as well as the mouse configuration. Mouse configuration, if you again accept the defaults, your drill down is going to be your double click, and your right mouse click is going to be your find. Those are our defaults. And a middle click, if you have a middle button on your mouse or a wheel, it's going to do nothing. If you want to change those settings, you can certainly do that to fit your mouse or to fit what your preferences are. And again, the status bar in the lower left corner is always going to indicate what the appropriate mouse clicks are. And so if you've forgotten which one is your drill down and which one is your find, that status bar message is going to be displaying that information for you. And also real quickly on user preferences, you can set, it's under the menu security, each of the items in your menu, you have the ability to set this options column. What this allows you to do is, for example, for somebody, a user that's doing payment entry only, they're only doing your receivables for the payments that you've received, you just want the payment entry window to open as soon as they launch the software. So you can come down to this payment entry window for this options column and say it's a startup window. That means that as soon as they launch the software, it will automatically open that window for them. It's a little thing, but it can be helpful and increase efficiency within the software. All right, so work lists. The purpose of the work list is, again, as a manager, you want to set daily tasks or activities for your users to accomplish. And so some of the things that you're doing within the software might be in the contract window. You're using this next contact date to indicate when you want this particular borrower to be next contacted. This starts to become a little bit more like a collection software at this point, where you want to start making calls on delinquent accounts and making better contact with people that aren't making payments. So we've got the work list process, which is used for that purpose. It's under your reports menu, and we have both a work list report and a work list process. The difference is the work list process will bring up each contract one after the other in the contract window, and so that as they save each record, it will move them on to the next record for them to make phone calls, process it, save it, and move on to the next one. And we'll see that in a moment. Or the report just gives you, obviously, a printout that you can use. There are, let me again change this. We got a column wrap again, which is affecting the display. Let me make that easier to read. I'll remove the phone number so that we can read this better. Could have also just changed it to a portrait report to leave the phone number on there. But you can see here there's basically 3 reasons why a contract is going to come up in a work list report. Is because that next contact date is today's date or a date in the past. And so generally, as you're working a work list, if you've finished an item, you're going to want to make sure you advance that next contact date to a date in the future so that they'll stop appearing on the work list if that's the reason that they're on there. The other reason that they may appear on a work list report is because they have a contact log that has a follow-up required checkbox on it, and it has not yet been completed. And so if that date is today's date or in the past and it hasn't been completed, it's going to show up on this report demanding attention. And the third reason that you'll see an item come up on the work list is they've got a past due amount that's past their grace period. And so if they have a past due amount, they'll show up on the work list as well. You can create a work list manually as well if you choose to. The keyboard shortcut for that is the F10 key. That will open up a selection window that allows you to select multiple different contracts that you want to work. And so you've probably put in some search criteria up here to figure out which ones you want to work, maybe ones for a certain portfolio, maybe ones for a certain contact date, things like that, and then just did your select all to select all of them. Or you can just pick which ones you want. So I'll pick a few and say OK. And you'll see what that does to your contract window is that it changes the title indicating that you're in a work list. You get the same thing if you ran the work list process over here and exported that list to your contract window. And it's showing up here that you've got records 1 of 5 to work through. And it's also going to give you a reason down here at the bottom as to why it's coming up. So in this case, there's a high priority message on this one. If we scroll through some of these, well, I'm sorry, this is, let me show you that a different way. But basically, as I was saying, this creates the work list that you can then scroll through these records one at a time, or as you save them, it will, doesn't like that I have a blank one, so let me set that to today's date, and then I can save. Okay, there you go. You save and it moves you on to record 2 of 5. And so as you continue to save each of these, I'll just say yes. It's not working the way that it should. It just takes you on to the next one in the work list. If you're using the work list process, the work list process will export to the contract window. I then press run. Now, like I was saying, you see the reason for the contract. When I created the manual list, there wasn't a reason for those. It was just the ones I'd selected. With the process, there's a reason why those were selected, and so you're going to see that reason displayed down here at the bottom of the screen. And as you scroll through, that should update to the various reasons why they're showing up in this work list. And once again, for any that are showing up for the reason of a calendar entry, such as this one here, which is a warning. If you double click on it, complete it because follow-up was required, save that. That's what will prevent it from showing up on any further work lists for it. Or again, if the reason they're showing up is the next contact date, setting that to a date in the future will keep it from showing up until then. So the notification dashboard we feel is a little bit more of an improved work list process. It allows you a little bit more control, it allows you to see a little bit better what's going on for your work list, and makes it a little bit easier to work that list. So your notification dashboard in Contract Collector, we've seen it a couple times already, is located under your System menu, System menu, Utilities submenu is your notification dashboard. And the tabs that you're going to see in contract collector are slightly different than those that you will see in lease collector, but they generally have the same purpose. You're going to have a tab for your delinquent payments, and so this tab shows you everybody who's delinquent and how delinquent they are. It also displays here their next contact date. I can make this window a little bit wider to display some of these other columns. And so that delinquent tab shows you who's delinquent and how much. And so you can work this just like a work list by double-clicking on each of these items here in your contract ID to bring them up in the contract window. You could then use this to get their phone number, make some other notes about the phone call that you had with them, probably in your contact log, save this entry, close it, and move on to your next item, double-clicking on it, and continue to work this just like a work list. It allows you to see a little bit better what's going on. You can look at the delinquent balance and jump to the bigger ones and hit those first. It just gives you a little bit more control of the order in which things are processed, which might be better for you. And again, you can sort this grid, like any grid, on any of the columns by double-clicking on that column, double-clicking on it again to sort in reverse column, and now I've got smaller delinquent numbers. So I got all my big delinquent numbers at the top, and so now I can work this list from the top down, hitting the big numbers first. Might be the better use of your time. The next tab that you will see, at least in Contract Collector, is the Payments Due column. It's the Rent Roll column in Lease Collector, and it just shows you what payments are coming due. And so this is kind of similar to doing a auto charge report with a future date. And so all of these tabs, you'll notice, have different selection criteria that you can choose up here. And so if you wanted to see a little bit farther out, the default here is for the next 10 days. These are the payments that are coming due within the next 10 days. So if you wanted to see a date range, you can choose that date selection option and set a date range. Each of these tabs have different date options that you can search on and different search criteria as well, so that you can minimize the items that are showing up in your display. If you do make any changes to any of this search criteria, it's not going to update your grid until you hit the refresh button at the bottom. And so it's waiting for you to select all the criteria that you want, and then when you're ready, press refresh, and it will update your list based on that new criteria. You can also print or preview any of these displays. And so again, it's going to either preview or print whatever you've got displayed in your grid. And so if you've set any search criteria and then press preview, it's going to print exactly what you see in your grid, so that you can maybe provide this to one of your users and they can just work down this printed list instead of working within the notification dashboard itself. Or maybe you need this for your records, and now you can file it, and so forth, just like any report. The calendar tab is pulling from the calendar information. We talked about this one a little bit already when we discussed the calendar. If you want to see just those items that are coming up because of the next contact date, again, these date filters are set to show any next contact dates within the next 30 days. Here's that list of items. Again, we can sort that by the next contact date with a double mouse click, and now they're in order by that next contact date if we wish. Maturity date tab allows us to see which contracts are going to be maturing soon. And so there aren't any in the next 30 days. I can just set this to none so that we see everybody. Again, I hit my refresh button, and here's the list of maturity dates for my contracts. And once again, we can sort that by the maturity date column and see those in order. Helpful information to see what's happening in the next few days. Escrow payout will show for your escrows any payouts that are due or past due potentially, so that you can see what's coming up in that regard. If you're using the relatively new taxes and insurance window, this will allow you to see whose insurance is maybe expiring. If you're doing auto loans, it's probably important for you to track that insurance, or even with mortgages, to making sure that the collateral is properly insured. You might be tracking those expiration dates in here and making sure that anything that has expired has been renewed, and then you can update that information. And your payment schedule or rent schedule for a lease collector allows you to see any changes that are pending on payment amounts. And so if you've scheduled a new payment amount for one of your loans and their payment's going to increase either due to an escrow change or a refinance or something like that, their payment amount is going to be different, or their interest rate is going to be different, that's going to show up on here. And so this is simply pulling from that schedule, the payment and interest schedule in the contract window for any changes that are coming soon. The next section that we'll be discussing is the accounting basics. I want to start off by saying a little disclaimer in that I'm not an accountant, so this is definitely not my expertise, but I am definitely familiar with the software and will hopefully give you some insight as to how the accounting is done within the software. 50% of our user base really doesn't use the general ledger, which is certainly just fine. They're using the software for the amortization of their loans. They don't worry about the general ledger. It just works in the background, and they use other software for their accounting, which is perfectly fine. But if you are using the general ledger, some of this may come into play a little bit more, and it may be important for you to understand how some of the accounting is done within the software. Generally, any discussion about the accounting in the software is going to start with the chart of accounts. And so your chart of account window is where each of your chart of accounts are set up. And we do follow a fairly standard setup for our chart of accounts. If we were to run a chart of account report, we could see all of the accounts that were set up for a certain portfolio. I'll go ahead and just preview this report so we can take a look. This report is showing us what accounts have been set up and what the name of that account is and whether it's a debit or credit account. Generally speaking, in Contract Collector, all of the 1,000 or 100 level accounts, depending on if you're using 3 or 4-digit account numbers, are going to be your assets. And so if it starts with a 1, that indicates that it's an asset account. If it starts with a 2, either 2,000 or 200, then it's a liability account. If it starts with a 3, then it's going to be an equity account. And if it starts with a 4, it's going to be an income account. And if it starts with a 5, it may be an expense, or it may be an income account, just depending on how you've set up your management level settings. And I'll show you that in just a moment. And anything that starts with a 6 or higher is going to be an expense. And so if you do need a few more numbers for your income accounts, as if 1,000 wasn't enough, we do have the ability under your management company window to change the ending income level. Generally, it's set as a 4, which means that only numbers that start with a 4 are going to be your income accounts. If you set this item here to a 5 in your management company settings, that will allow you a few more expense accounts if your 4s and 5s are income, or a few more income accounts is what I meant to say. Both the 4s and 5s will be incomes, and your expenses will start then at 6 and above. Hit the wrong button. Contract Collector uses a pretty standard double entry accounting system, meaning that anytime there's a transaction, there's always an exchange between 2 accounts. This is done in order to keep the accounting equation in balance, which is basically saying that assets is going to equal your liabilities plus your owner equity. And so everything in Contract Collector uses a debit and a credit. Anytime you do a transaction, it's always going to affect 2 accounts and keep this equation in balance. So then what you're going to see under cash accounting, which is the most common and the most simple situation, is that anytime you have a receivable, income is recognized when the money is received. And so even though they may owe you something, if they haven't paid it yet, it's not recognized until you actually receive it. So on the accounting side, you're going to have a debit and a credit that's only posted when you receive a payment. And so on this 3-line journal entry here from the receivables journal, there's a charge line that happened on March 1st. That's a non-posting transaction, so even though it's showing a debit and credit amount account over in your debit credit column, that's not posted to your chart of accounts. That's a non-posting entry. However, when that payment is received, when this interest was received and when this principal was received on March 10th, we did post to the chart of accounts, and we debited account 1100 and we credited either 4200 or 4100 for your income account for that money. So we received in cash, we debited cash, and credited the income account. Anytime you have an expense in your payables journal, again, the money is only recognized when you pay it. And so if you're invoiced and you owe a vendor money, it hasn't hit your chart of accounts until you actually write out that check or create the payment line. So again, the invoice line here, line number 1 on this payable, is a non-posting transaction, but when it was paid, which was on this, the same date, January 31st, we created a transaction that debited your expense account and credited the cash account. So money went out of your cash account and out of your bank. Accrual accounting becomes a lot more complex. It's really a lot more difficult to follow these transactions. Actually, every time you enter a payment in Contract Collector, the software is creating an extensive amount of journal entries for you, both in the receivables journal and in the adjustments journal. So if you're choosing to use accrual accounting, it's going to be a lot more extensive on your general ledger. So what you're going to see, though, is that both your charge lines and your payment lines are going to be posting items in your chart of accounts then at that point. And so what you're seeing then happen is when that charge happens, you're having a transaction that takes place between both your long-term and your short-term accounts receivable account. And then when it's finally paid, that's when you see the debit to your cash account indicating that money came in, and a credit to your income accounts at that point. For payables, the same way, an expense is recognized as soon as you're obligated to pay it. And so in that case, again, both the I line for your invoice line on your payables is going to post to your general ledger, and that's going to hit your expense account at that point, and then your accounts payable account, indicating that you owe this money. That's a liability then at this point, so that when you do finally pay it, whether it's the same date or a date later, a few days later, or if at all, you will see that your accounts payable account is then debited, and your cash account then at that point is credited, indicating that the money went out of your bank. And so what's happening in Contract Collector every time you create a new contract is the software is actually creating an adjustment journal entry for your long-term receivables that indicates that they owe this amount of principal. And so when you set up a new loan in Contract Collector, if that loan has a $25,000 principal balance, then the software is going to create an adjustment journal entry to increase your long-term receivables account by debiting that account and crediting your owner equity account. And then again, when funds are, when a payment becomes due, then at that point, we will change that amount of money for that specified payment amount from being a long-term receivable to a short-term receivable with again, that's the charge line in your receivables journal window. And then at the time when it's paid, at the time that they make that payment, we make the entry in your receivables journal window for the principal and the interest, but we will also make an adjustment, two adjustment journal entries in your adjustment journal to move money from your owner equity, first of all, to your short-term receivables to balance out that part of the equation, and then also a entry for the principal portion. And so these amounts here that you're seeing are going to match the principal and interest part of the payment. I don't have a picture of it, but we saw it earlier right here when the payment was received. And so these amounts here are balancing out the amounts we see here. So in your setup for Contract Collector, again, the setup for your general ledger really begins, first of all, in the chart of accounts window. And then the second step is in the assigning of those accounts in your portfolio window. And so we looked at this briefly already. In your portfolio window, you have the GL Info tab. And this is where we're seeing all of those bank IDs and the chart of account IDs that were set up with your initial setup sequence or some point thereafter. And these are the designated accounts that the software is using. This one here is cash accounting, and so it's a simple situation. Let me show you. This one here is accrual accounting. And so this one is requiring a few more accounts, including that long-term and short-term receivable accounts. And so this is how you designate which accounts are going to be used in those transactions. This also allows you to set your fiscal year. If your fiscal year begins somewhere other than January, you can change that setting. And this will also show what the COA range, or your chart of account range, is for this particular portfolio. This generally means that you cannot post transactions outside of this range. And so if I had a payment that I wanted to go enter for 2010, if I'm entering some historical payments, I'm not going to be allowed to. The payment entry window is going to say that I don't have a chart of accounts for that date. And that's because this chart of account range only goes back to 2011. And so particularly, again, if you're moving into a new calendar year, that's when you're using the chart of account duplication process to create 2013's chart of accounts. And then you would see this year advance for you to 2013, indicating that that's the last year for your for this particular portfolio that can be used to post payments. There's a few other settings on here. We're not going to talk about necessarily all of them. One other option that you have is with Contract Collector, you can track multiple banks. There are some situations where you're required to maybe maintain a separate bank account for your escrows. Particularly in property management and lease collector, many management companies are required to maintain a separate bank account for security deposits. And so what you would find in that situation is you're going to be using a different bank ID here for your escrow or security deposit information. Let me see if I've got one. No, that one's both the same. Those are both the same. So what that would look like, just real quickly, I'll delete that account out of there. I'll change this bank. And we generally don't recommend changing banks. If you do need to change bank IDs, you're going to want to contact technical support so we can discuss how that's going to best work for you. But in a situation where that escrow was going to a different bank, this is what you would see in the portfolio window, just a different bank ID being assigned to that escrow account. What's going to happen in this situation is if you receive a check that includes payment for the regular payment as well as escrow, the bank deposit slip is going to create a transfer report for you. And so you're going to deposit that check into one of the two designated accounts, and it will give you a report that you can use to transfer the necessary funds from the account where that check was deposited to the other account. There may also be some situations like this one here, where you need to track another bank account for some other reason. So you can track an unlimited number of banks, although if you're tracking more than 3, it's going to be really kind of a nightmare because the transfer reports that you're going to be getting are going to be kind of insane. But if you do need to track more banks, there are definitely situations where that might be necessary. And again, the deposit slip process will give you a transfer report if you do need to transfer any funds from one account to another because of a check deposit. And the other part of the program that's affecting this is going to be the charge codes that you're using. So when you designate that a charge is due, whether it's a late fee or a regular payment, that's going to indicate the other half of the equation, or the credit account, basically, for that entry. So if we look at, for example, a late fee, Anytime a late fee is paid, the GL credit account right now is assigned to 4,500 for this account. If we look at your regular payment, it's been assigned both a GL account for the principal portion and an interest portion as well. And so if you're doing any changes to your chart of accounts, you may need to change the designated accounts here for usually the credit portion of that transaction, so that the money's actually being deposited to the accounts that you want them to go to, whether it's an income or and then finally on the bank types on that, of course the PMT charge code is required to be an operating account charge code. If we look at one of the escrow accounts, we'll notice that it's been assigned the bank type escrow, and so that helps it determine what other account back here in your general ledger of your portfolio window is going to be designated. And so if you're receiving a payment for code E1, that's going to be an escrow account. If it's going to a different bank, then it's going to be deposited to that bank account. And so you can set these if you're using another bank. This is where you would set this to other, and then any payments received into this E1 account would then be tied back, in this case, to the bank 004 and the 1210 county tax reserve asset. Generally speaking, you don't need to get this extensive into the setup of the general ledger. Most of this is done for you. If you accept our defaults, those are just fine. It's just something to be aware of and make changes toward if you need to. So the financial statement features in Contract Collector allow you to run several different financial statements. The primary ones are going to be your balance sheet, your profit and loss, your trial balance, and then just miscellaneous, some general ledger reports that you can set up. So we're going to talk first about the financial statement setup and how those are done. There are two windows that you're going to be using to create financial statements, and then a separate window to run financial statements. So under your system setup, we have your financial statement setup window, which is where the setup is done. So it's a data entry window. Like the data entry windows we've seen earlier, it's got the primary ID in the upper left-hand corner, and then various other items to assign to that financial statement. And so to create a new financial statement, pressing the New button up on the top toolbar starts a new entry in this data entry window, and then you simply specify what you want to use as the ID. I'll go P&L 9B for this example, and this will be a profit and loss statement. And then next, just designating what type it is, profit and loss, balance sheet, or trial balance. And so obviously for this example, we'll choose profit and loss. And then after selecting that statement type, the next thing you're going to need to do is generate the columns that will appear on that report. And so based on whatever statement type you choose will be what the possibilities are for both your fields available and your fields to print. And so as soon as I press that Generate button for my columns, it creates the appropriate columns that are available for this statement type, the profit and loss. And it gives me a designated set of fields that will print, and again, a large list of available fields. So very similar to your advanced reporting elsewhere in the software, you can choose from any of these columns to add to the report, and you can similarly remove these if you need to, move them up and down so that they're in the order that you wish them to appear. We have other various options for, again, setting your font size and type. You can choose to suppress 0 for any accounts that might just have no activity. Generally, you don't need to see those. If you do use the budget features in the software, which are set up again in that chart of account window, it has the ability for you to set up budgets for each of your accounts. Then you may want to do some variants calculations on your financial statements to see how close or how far away you are from those budget figures, and you can choose actual minus budget or budget minus actual as that option. But finally, the last thing that you need to set up before you can save the financial statement are going to be the rows that appear. And so these are going to be pulling from the chart of account information. And so when I hit generate, it's going to ask me which portfolios chart of accounts I want to use. If you've kept it simple and all portfolios are the same, it's not going to matter which one you choose. And so generally, again, we recommend keeping it simple, having them all the same. If they start to vary, though, then you're going to need to have different financial statements for each portfolio that does have accounts that don't match the others. And so again, in this case, it doesn't matter which I choose, so I'll say OK. And it will keep track of that source ID so that you know which ones go with which portfolios if you do have some that don't line up. What that will do is then you'll notice it created, again, a long list of rows over here. These are the rows that could potentially be appearing on your financial statement. Again, you can customize many of these. You can even customize the calculations to add and subtract numbers if you choose to. It gets a little more complicated, but you can certainly do that if you need to, so that those calculations are done when you run those financial statements. Then at this point, you can just go ahead and save that entry with the usual save button up on your toolbar. That will save that new financial statement that you can run. We talked about earlier that the primary ID in the upper left-hand corner does not allow drill down. There are exceptions to every rule, and that's, in this case, you can drill down on the primary ID, and it will take you to that report in the financial statement window, so you can immediately run this report and see if it's printing the way that you want it to print or showing up. And so I can preview, and it will bring up that financial statement that I just created in here. And you'll notice it's suppressing the zeros, and this is just the activity that's happened. Profit and loss, so it's the income and expense accounts for this portfolio. And we can scroll through the various portfolios and see each of their financials. So a little bit more on this financial statement window. It is available through your GL menu, financial statements, the financial statement window. It's also available directly from your reporting toolbar. You can choose the financial statement windows that way, and it will open up financial statement window. The first thing it allows you to select is which statement you want to run. And so you simply select which statement if your mouse doesn't freak out. OK. So you can select it from the drop-down list, but it is an ID field like everywhere else, and so the F2 functions do work. You can press F2, put in your search criteria for which financial that you're looking for, and run that financial statement. And again, drill down does work from here as well, so I can drill down back to my financial statement setup window to make some more tweaks on this statement, save my changes here, go back and reprint it again. And you'll notice that this screen also includes that zero suppress option. It remembers it from your settings over here, but again, you may or may not want to run that, and so you can turn it on or off directly here. The financial statement window also allows you to consolidate based on other information in the software. And so generally, it's done by each portfolio, but you can also choose to consolidate by client and run one financial statement for each of your clients that will show the consolidated activity based on their percentage of ownership for their portfolios. Client and portfolio breaks it down for each client, and so now it's not consolidated, but it's going to show based on the client percentage still, and it's going to break out each of their portfolios separately so that that client can get a breakdown for each of their portfolios individually. And then portfolio group allows you to run it off of your portfolio groups that you've set up. So again, it's going to consolidate based on the portfolio group that you've selected. Just another way of viewing your information. With most of your financials, you're going to be selecting what month you want to run it for. And again, for your convenience, we have a drop-down list for that purpose. It includes dates in the past as well as up into the future so that you can run reports for different reasons. One example might be we've got a 12-month P&L report that we can run. And so if you wanted to see it just for this year, even though there's probably not going to be any activity for the end of the year yet, December 2012, it's going to give it still, in this case, it's a lot of zeros for this particular date range. Let me see if I've got anything. No, that's not very exciting. Let me do this one slightly different. Let's see. Let's try this one. This one might be better. There we go. This is a lot more exciting. So you can see January through June we've had activity, but we don't have any for the end of the year. If I wanted to throw a total on this, and we'll see if we've got room, again, I can drill down on that financial ID and come over here to my list of columns, and I can put in total actual as the new column on there. And I'm a little bit worried about space, so I'm going to remove the account ID so we don't column wrap. I'm going to save those changes, come back over here, and again with December 2012, preview that. And now we should have, we don't. I did not save or something. Let me try that again. So it's there. It's saved. Let me reopen it. And again, preview. There we go. Now it's going to show that total actual column, and it's a little bit cut off because, again, of our space, but you're seeing the total actual for the year to date, basically. And I must have selected something wrong again because now we've got, I did the wrong. I didn't select the month this time. So now let me go back to December. There we go. Sorry. There we go. Now we've got total activity for the year, and so we can kind of see the year-to-date activity on this report. Like I was getting at, you've got a limited set of options in this list. It goes out a little bit into the future and back a little bit into the past. You do have the full ability to run this report for any date, however. Using your F2 option for your find, date, of course, really doesn't matter. You're just looking for month and year in this case. So just select any month and select any year in the future or back into the past. And so I can still run a financial statement for 2002, say, okay, it will put that date there for me in the drop-down list, even though it wasn't coming up prior. It only went back to 2010 in the list. And then, of course, you can select on any portfolio ID, or if you change this by client, then you're selecting the pick list on the client ID, and so forth. So a little bit more on each of the financial statements. The balance sheet within the software is obviously going to run based on your assets and liabilities. And so if we choose the balance sheet, and we will again go back to today's date here, June of 12. And preview this financial statement by portfolio. And so with zero suppress, here is our balance sheet, which is showing us the position of our company at this point in time, and our assets equal to liabilities plus the owner equity. Assets equals liability plus owner equity, the accounting equation. The other set that you're going to be running from here, the other financial statements, is going to be your profit and loss, as we've kind of seen as well. I'll do a last year or profit and loss that includes information about last year's or compares last year's numbers, which again, last year's numbers were all zeros in this case, so not very exciting. But you can see how using this to get information on your income and expenses for the year or the period. And the third one is a trial balance. With the trial balance, this is used to make sure that your accounting is all in balance, that every transaction had a debit and credit, and that everything balanced out. And if you preview this, you get again a listing of each account ID. And theoretically, if everything's in balance, you'll have zeros at the bottom of your trial balance. That just makes sure all of your accounting is being done appropriately. Kind of an alternate trial balance that you can use is with the general ledger report. We have a summary general ledger. And so if we choose the summary general ledger, which comes up by default, again, I will zero suppress to keep it simple and preview this report. It's going to come up with pretty much the same thing that we were seeing in the trial balance. In this case, you're looking for your debit and your credit activity to be equal to each other. And so as long as those two are equal, you know that you're in balance and that all of your accounting is happening appropriately. If for whatever reason something isn't right or you need more information as to what's going on, you can do a detailed version of the general ledger, and this will pull from each of the three journals and give you what makes up those numbers. And so for each account here, we're seeing the activity that happened transaction by transaction, which make up these numbers that we're seeing on the summary version of the report so that we can track something down further. All right, the email features in Contract Collector over the last several years has become more and more important as a lot of companies have tried to do more and more communication via email, sending out invoices as opposed to mailing them, saving money on postage, as well as providing a little bit more timely information to their borrowers and clients and anyone that they're communicating with. And so we've input a number of email features into Contract Collector. So looking at the software, the first place that starts is with setting up your email settings in your user window. And so each user using the software may have the same settings, or you may make them each different, just depending on how you want the software to work. If we look at demo, we've set up already the email settings on this user. The very first thing that you're going to see is the email protocol list. We've got a number of different email protocols that you can use within Contract Collector. And different ones have worked better at different points in time as technology changes. Each of these have gone through their phase of usefulness. Right now, CDO-sys, which stands for Collaboration Data Objects, is the most popular. It's the one that works the best. If you've got an older computer, you might find that the ANSMTP works better. If you use Outlook, you might find that Microsoft Outlook options, both that one and Outlook Alternate, may work. Generally speaking, we really only recommend and support the CDO-sys option. The other ones you might find work, but we've really only had success getting the CDO-sys recently to work out. Older computers, the ANSMTP does work, but really everything has kind of moved to the CDO-sys as far as what works best. Then, of course, your display name can be whatever you want it to be. Your email address, easy enough, needs to be your email address that you're using. Your mail server depends on what email host you're using. Again, there are many different options, AOL, Comcast, Juno. We've really found that Gmail works best. We've tried many of the others. The problem with using a third-party application like Contract Collector to send email is that you're dealing with a ton of security. There's both security on your computer, there's security with your email host. They're trying to prevent viruses from sending emails. And so they don't know any different that Contract Collector is not a virus. So unless you've got it set up correctly, so that you're allowing Contract Collector specifically to send emails on your behalf, you're going to fight a lot of that security. And Gmail is just the one that we found is the friendliest and the easiest to set up when it comes to that. AOL isn't too bad. Hotmail's difficult. but Gmail really works the best. Their settings are the easiest to deal with. It's really straightforward. And so if we're helping you set up an account, they're free at Gmail, so that's usually what we recommend people use. Username, again, generally is going to be your email address. It may be different, particularly with Outlook. And then your password. And you can choose to have the software remember your password or not. If you choose to not have it remembered, then you simply have to input it each time you're sending an email, which will get a little annoying. But if you do want that extra security of somebody who might sit down at your computer to use it and not send emails without you knowing, then you may want to leave that unchecked so that your password is not remembered. And the SSL secure connection, again, ties back into a little bit with the mail server that you're using. With Gmail, you're definitely going to want to leave that checked because we do need to use a secure connection for that, basically to provide this username and password to authenticate that Contract Collector is a program that should be sending email on your behalf. So after you've got that setup done, the next portion of the setup that you will need to do is for each contract or for each client. In your client or contract window, we have the phone information. And if I bring up a client, oh goodness. If I bring up a client that has an email address, you will see that the email has been used as the description and their email address was put under the phone number information. Basically, the phone tab is simply more generally a contact tab for how to contact this person. We do require that the description somewhere include the word email. And that can be email with a hyphen, e-mail, or it can be all run together, just email without any spaces or breaks. You can send an email directly from the contract window here if you're just looking to send general communication email to a client or to a contract in this case. And so in this case here, I've set up the email address as a distribution list, and so you'll see that it includes a little bit more than just the word email, and we'll come back to that a little bit more later. But the email address for this contract is gravecosoftware@hotmail.com. If I press this email button, it will open up an email window for me to type in a body to my message, or a message body. I can put any subject that I want on here. It's put in their email address for me. Whoops. Their email address for me there in the to information. If I wanted to attach a file, I could. And then basically, when I'm ready, I can press the send email button. That will send that borrower an email. We will get a confirmation message here that that email's been sent. But this is taking a little bit longer than it should. What would happen if it was successful is that email, of course, would have been sent to that email address. And what we would have seen in the contact log is there would have been an email. Well, it did add even though it failed to send the email, we did create those calendar entries here. In the contact log, and so that's what you would see is that we had this email correspondence, and that's why you may want to use Contract Collector instead of just using your email program directly, is that way you maintain that communication and what was part of that body of that email. It's all going to show up here if I double click on this entry. Here in the contact calendar log, we see what was sent and that full body of that message. We can also see exactly what time it was sent on. And again, this will print on any contact calendar log report that we choose to print. And so it maintains a full list of all communications that happened with this borrower. Moving on to emailing reports. Any of the reports can obviously be emailed as well. As an example, we'll use the contract balance report. And so in here, you simply set up your filters as you want to print it, and then press the email button. And the email button will open up this email window again for us to first input who we want to send it to, because this is just a general report. We can decide who we want to send it to. If we click on the drop-down list, it will give us both all of our clients as well as all of our loans that have email addresses. So we can choose from here. We can also just type them into the two if they're not. For maybe you're sending this to your lawyer or to your accountant, and you're emailing them this report, they might not be set up in there. This list will include anybody in the vendor window as well that has an email address in their address phone section. So if you've got your lawyer set up as a vendor, then they might still be showing up in this drop-down list. But of course, you can still type them in. The blind carbon copy as well as the carbon copy works the same way. You can just select your multiple email addresses that you want to CC the report to. You'll also notice that the subject line came up for us, filled in with the name of this report, as well as the date and time that this report was generated. You can certainly edit the subject line as necessary to make sense for what you need to do. I'm going to go ahead and select, I know it's not going to work, but I will select, again, Graveco Software Hotmail for my email address, and I will choose the attachment type. There are several different attachment types that you can use. Basically, this is the same as the save report as. Simply what the software is going to do is it's going to save the report as whatever attachment type you choose, and then attach that to your email. Generally speaking, you're probably going to want to use the PDF file option or possibly the Excel option. You should probably stay away from most of the others. Text file can be hard to read, so we don't usually recommend that. And not everything is going to work real well in Word. So PDF is usually the best one to stick with. HTML might not be too bad either, because most email programs can really easily read HTML, and so that might be acceptable in some cases. But going with the PDF as the most common, then of course put in anything you want in the body of the email. And when you're ready, go ahead and press send, and just to try it to see, maybe it will work eventually. It will go out and send that email. And again, it's going to send this report with all of its information to everyone you send it to, and it's all going to be exactly the same. And so the attachment that it makes, it sends one email with that attachment, and the email that everybody gets is exactly the same. We'll go out here, and what you would see, all of these, again, if you remember my settings in my user window, software at gravecosoftware.com is what we're using as who these emails are coming from. And so if it were working, the software would be interfacing with this email address, sending these emails on behalf of Contract Collector, and they will show up in your sent email. And just to kind of prove that this works, I do have some emails that I tested with a few days ago when it was working from my connection, and with the attachment in there. And so it attaches the PDF. There's the body of the email as we put it in, just like you'd sent it any other way. And so that way you can maintain still a list of what was sent out in the sent folder of your host email address. We'll come back to that. Okay, so that failed. Generally what you would have gotten is the message that it was successful, which usually just comes up in the upper right-hand corner as a passive message indicating that it was successful. So that's how you email reports. When you start emailing letters or doing a distribution list, that's when you're probably just going to be sending each borrower their appropriate portion of the notice or letter. And so as an example, we will use the delinquent payment notice. And so with this option, again, you set the criteria here for who you want to send the letter to. Generally, we would recommend previewing it first, making sure, yes, indeed, these are the ones that we want to send out, and that we're not missing any, or that we're not sending one to somebody who shouldn't be getting one. When we're ready, we can go ahead and press the email button. And again, it will default our subject for us. At this point, we have a choice. If we wanted to send, for example, our lawyer all of the letters that we were sending out, or to our accountant, for whatever reason, they wanted a list of all the letters we're sending out, then we would leave it on recipient list and choose just one recipient. Again, it's going to send one attachment with everybody's delinquent letter attached in that single PDF file. So again, we would choose the PDF option as our attachment type. It's going to send one PDF file that contains multiple pages, with each page being a different, for one of your different borrowers. If you choose the distribution list, then what the software is going to do is, now we choose one of our distribution lists that we want to send to, and this will send everybody in this email distribution list just their portion of their letter. And so in this case, the software is going to divide this up. It's going to send multiple different emails on your behalf. And so this can take a little bit of time depending on how many letters you are sending. Again, put in your body as you want it to appear. What you can do is copy into that as well. And so commonly you would have the same thing being used over and over for the body, so you can have those saved elsewhere. And paste these in to the body of your email, and then send this email. You also have the option of anybody who doesn't have a qualifying email address but would be getting a report based on your settings in your delinquent notice. You can choose to print those. And so it's going to email everybody it can, and then print the remainders for you to mail out. In this case, I don't have a printer, and the email isn't going to work, so I'm not going to press send email. But what that would do is it would go out and send that email. And now if I look back here, I didn't save any of them, so it's not terribly helpful. But what you would get is something that looked like this. It's going to have your PDF as the attachment. I can then download, or the recipient would then be downloading this file, saving it, and opening this file, and it would look something like this when it comes up for them. It's the one-page document for this one recipient, Jeffrey Bradford, and it's just his delinquent notice. And again, this works by using the distribution lists. Which are set up in the software with the description that you use for your email address. And so if we look again at 1003, I believe, his email description was set up specifically as email-list2. That makes him part of that specific email distribution list. Generally speaking, you're probably going to want to pick one description and stick with that for all of your emails, and just have one distribution list. But there may be reasons why you'd want to separate that as well, so that you do have different distribution lists if you need to go to that level. And again, this description, you can F2 to do a find for your descriptions that you would want to use. So one of our last topics today is going to be the IRS 1098, 1099 reporting features in the software. If you are required to report 1098s, 1099s, this is definitely going to be a very useful part of the program for you to both keep track of what you need to report as well as do the reporting for you. The third-party reporting is under your reports menu, third-party reports, and then you have the choice of the 1098 and 1099 process. Both screens are pretty much very similar in nature, and as far as particularly the e-filing process is concerned, both will work identically, so we will talk primarily about the 1098 reporting process, but the 1099 is going to be identical as far as the e-filing. Both the 1098 and 1099 processes allow you to run an audit report. We definitely very highly recommend running that audit report prior to, of course, submitting your real information to the IRS. And if you use the e-file option, we use a third-party agency to submit those. They're actually going through a company called Nelco Solutions, and they're kind of an invisible interface, though, and they provide a lot of features as well, which we'll talk about in a moment for processing your 1098s or 1099s. But first of all, on the audit report, again, we definitely recommend running that just to make sure that the information that you're going to be submitting, even if you're using the paper forms, is correct. And we also recommend that you not only run that audit report, but you compare that against other reports in the software. For example, for your 1098s, primarily the report that you would use to make your comparison is the payment summary report. This report you can run for a date range, and so generally speaking, you'd be setting it for last year. So we will go ahead and do that, 01/01/2011, through the end of the year, because we want to see the whole year that would be submitted to the IRS for that reporting year. And if we preview this report, what we should get is a grand total of the interest paid amount for each of your contracts. And so for each contract, it's putting the contract on there once and summing up all of the interest that contract paid for the year and giving us a grand total at the bottom. What we're looking for is this number to match with what we're reporting to the IRS. There may be lots of different reasons why someone paid interest, but they're not being included on your 1098s. Those could be legitimate reasons, or they could be accidental. For example, if they don't have a tax ID in the contract window, then they're not eligible to have a 1098 or 1099 because the IRS is kind of upset if they don't have that number on the statements that they get. And so if you don't have that tax ID included, then they're going to be on your payment summary report, but they're not going to be on your IRS audit report. And so that's kind of one of the first things you're looking for. The other thing is based on the contract type, you may have set them up to not get a 1098, 1099. If you're doing auto loans, generally auto loans do not require a 1098, and so you may be doing some types of loans that don't qualify. You don't need to send them a 1098. So they're not going to include a 1098. That checkbox will not be checked, and they will not get a 1098 because of that, even though they have a tax ID. And so there are several different things in the software that could prevent these two reports from matching. The idea being you're just doing some due diligence to check that what you're submitting is correct to the IRS, and that you've set up everything in the software the way that it should be. You can also set a minimum limit in both your 1098s and 1099s. Generally speaking, this amount, well, it defaults to $600 because that's generally what the IRS has asked. Anything less than that, then they don't need a 1098 being sent to them. A lot of people set that to $0 just to send everybody one. That way they've kind of done their part. And so if you want to send out those extra ones, that's certainly just fine. A lot of people will set that to $0 and just send everybody their 1098, even though they may be below that limit. Setting your tax year should default for you automatically, so you don't need to worry about that. And then if you're doing the paper forms, you can certainly select that option. At this point, we're going back to our forms maintenance now and using one of the forms that we've set up in forms maintenance. If you are doing paper forms, it may be necessary for you to update this report's ID if the IRS changes the layout of their paper forms, which they tend to do almost every year. So you may need to move things around a little bit to make it come up in the right place. But most people now have moved on to using the electronic e-filing option, which is what we're going to talk about most for the remainder of this session. When you change it to the electronic e-filing option, you will notice that there are several fields at the bottom that become available. Our preview and print button have disappeared. We now have a submit button instead. And some of these smaller buttons are now available, as well as an IRS file name location. Generally, you don't need to worry about these little buttons or this file location. You can just leave them at their defaults. We will talk a little bit more about some of them in just a moment. All you really need to do is press the submit button to start the process of submitting your 1098s once you've confirmed that the data is correct. Before I do that, though, I'm going to go out and show you where some of this setup information is going to come from. It's coming again from your management company window. You're going to have your management company name and your management company address. There are some situations where, particularly with your 1099s, you might be submitting them from your portfolios instead of from your overall management company, particularly in third-party loan servicing situations. And so for your 1099s, you can control whether it's coming from your management company or from your portfolio. But again, generally speaking, it's the setup information, that being what we're communicating with Nelco Solutions as our information, is going to be this management company name and address, as well as this phone information. And they are asking for a phone number, and we identify that phone number one of two ways, either with a description of phone or with a description of office. And so it's going to be looking for one of those two descriptions. If you don't have one here that matches that description, it will allow you to input it on the setup screen that we'll see in just a moment. And I'm going to go ahead and also add an email address, which is what it's looking for as well. It will be required, but again, you can input it on the next screen. So I'm going to save those changes and then go back here. Oops, I thought I said save. Okay. And now we're ready to go ahead and press this submit button. And the first thing that it does is it goes through the process, does all of its calculations for the forms that it will be submitting, and gives us this count. We've got 5 IRS 1098s to submit and a grand total for what will be submitted. Go ahead and press OK to that message if that looks correct to what you've audited on other reports. And the first thing that you'll get, and you'll only get this once, is the account setup. This allows you, again, to make sure that this just tells Nelco who's sending them this information. And so it includes a variation of your user ID that you logged into the software with, and a password, and then the email address for the address, phone numbers that they're asking for to identify who's sending them this information. Generally speaking, if all of this is correct, we just go ahead and press save, and it will take us to the next dialog box in the wizard, which is what we want them to do with this information. And so we're presented with a number of different options here in the transmit dialog. The first one is what service we want to request. We can choose just to do the recipient federal e-filing, or more commonly, we're probably going to be doing both the recipient federal e-filing as well as a mailing to the recipients. Or we might also be doing option number 5, which is getting an archive copy sent back to us, as well as the recipient federal e-filing and mailing happen. And the pricing for each of these options is a little bit different. Those are really the 3 most common services that are used. You can get, I'm going to go ahead and actually cancel out of this for a moment and show you, and it tells me that it was aborted. If I go to my help manual and go to operating features, advanced operating features, and electronic filing, you will see that this includes a complete list of all of those service options down here. Again, the primary ones are being highlighted for you, and what the current pricing is for those. And again, that tends to change every year, but they've been about the same for the last couple of years, which for the archive copy, service number 5, you're looking at about $1.50 per form. And so ultimately that saves you the expense of purchasing envelopes, purchasing paper, purchasing postage, and spending your time stuffing those envelopes, mailing them out. And if you choose that service number 5, they're going to send you a bulk copy of everything for your file that was sent out to each of the recipients. So going back to the process, you will notice now if I go back and press submit, we're going to bypass that first step, the setup window. The file already exists because I did it today. And we go right back to that transmit process. We'll look at how to get back to that setup window if you do need to make changes in just a moment. So after you've selected whichever service that you want, we'll go ahead and choose 5. The next thing that you might need to change is the form type. Actually, I'm not going to do 5. I'm going to go ahead and just do 3 because doing 5 requires that I fill out some more information about where that bulk copy will be sent back to. It gets a little more complicated, so I'm just going to do 3, which is just the recipient mailing and recipient federal e-filing. So this is going to file with the IRS and send each recipient their copy. In some situations, you might change the form type to being the corrected federal returns. You only need to do this if you find out that what you submitted the first time was incorrect and you need to submit a correction. Generally speaking, most everything else isn't used or isn't used yet. So that's your form type. And then at this point, again, it's verifying your quantity up here, your filing year. When you're ready, just go ahead and hit transmit. And for some reason, we're having better communication now through the internet. And actually, at this point, I'm going to stop right here and, again, cancel out of that. And I'm going to jump us into a different copy. I have a special account so that I don't have to actually make payment because I don't want to pay them for what we're going to practice with. So let me so again, under your third-party reports, we bring up the 1098 process. In this case, I haven't set up my management company with that email and phone number, so you'll see what this looks like if you haven't filled in the required information. When I press submit, again, we'll get the setup screen, and this time the phone number is missing. So we simply plug in a phone number. I'll do it this way. And our email address. And then press save. It takes us to our next option, which is to choose our service, change our form type if necessary, press transmit. And as I was saying, the next screen that comes up is this confirmation window. This is how you make payment for the forms that you're submitting. And so here's the total cost displayed for you so you know what you're paying for. Then you simply choose your payment method. Typically, credit card is what you're going to use. Choose Visa. And what I get, because I've got a special account, is this Visa number that I can use to pay for it, which of course is not a real credit card number. So I can copy and paste that credit card number over here into my credit card information. You're going to plug in your expiration date here with a 4-digit year. Go out and confirm your credit card number, make payment, and give you this message that the process has completed successfully. So you say OK to that, and pretty much then at that point, you're done. That information has been submitted. You should receive your copy within a few days, and your recipient should as well. If you want to come back at any point in time and check on the status of that batch, that's when you would use these little buttons down at the bottom. Pressing the status button will bring up a check status confirmation window. You simply select which batch you want to check the status on, and if you've done multiple submissions, you'll have a batch for each one. Select the batch and then press submit. It will go out and check the status of that batch and give you information on it. And so right now, the invoice has been paid because we've confirmed it with that credit card. And so some of the other status options that you will see is that they've actually gone out and done their part and submitted those. So in going back to our help, once again to operating features, advanced operating features, electronic filing, and if we scroll down, we'll see a full list of the status codes that are available. So we saw the invoice pending and the invoice paid. Other ones that you're going to see are filing accepted, filing complete, filing rejected, if it was rejected, and possibly some of these other statuses as appropriate. So that's what you'd be looking for, is to making sure that those did get completed. And the other thing that you can do is, if you do need to change your setup, maybe, again, if you submitted last year, you're not going to need to do that setup again. But if you want to make sure before you submit that all of that information is still correct, you can come back out here to that setup screen, make any changes as necessary, press save to make sure that you're submitting the most recent information if there have been changes to your address or phone numbers and so forth. You may get a series of errors, and so it is possible that through a number of different factors, we've created something that it's not liking. You're required to have Social Security numbers or tax IDs that match a certain format. They have to be a certain length. If they're not a certain length, then they're not going to be accepted by the IRS, and you're going to get an error message in the process that indicates that you've got something that isn't valid. They also have to have valid valid mailing addresses for their information. So as just an example of to create an error, I'm going to go out and edit the mailing address for this person, and I'm going to put an invalid state in there, save that, and say OK. And so if you had a data entry error in inputting your addresses, and you attempted to go out and send a 1098 or 1099 under your reports, third-party reporting, 1098 process. Again, I'm going to choose the electronic filing and press submit. And we already have a file for this date, and so it's wanting to overwrite it. We say yes. And again, I'll choose service number 3 and say transmit. And we should get an error message then at this point that indicates this particular borrower failed the validation. And so there was something wrong with the way this person was set up. Some of these messages are pretty good, some of these messages aren't. Whether they're good or not, they usually will give the tax ID for who the problem ties back to. Sometimes they'll list the name. In this case, it's showing Ernie Johnson, and that the problem is that they have an invalid state of W. And so in this case, it's a really good message that's really obvious to understand what the problem is. Some aren't as easy. Unfortunately, some of these messages, these are all coming back from their servers as to what the problem is. And so you may just need to go search for this particular tax ID. And so if you need to do that, you can use again, the find window options in your contract window to go search for that ID if you need to. In this case, we can just jump back to who we know it is, Ernie Johnson, make our correction to the address, and then submit again. And the whole thing will fail. It's not going to do the ones that are accepted, and so the entire process will fail if any one of them has a bad address. That way you can just go back and redo the whole process again for everybody. Lastly, we do have a manager button down here. Again, technically, or typically, you'd be using technical support on the phone to help you with this. This has a lot of different options in it. The primary one being this e-file log. We keep track of each time you attempt to submit and what the response back is from their servers as to what went wrong, if something went wrong. And so if you did fail, what you would have gotten is that error message. If you have multiple problems, they're listed, but that list can only get so long. And so if you've got lots and lots that have error messages, each time you go and submit and you get 3 more and then 3 more. The display is only showing the first 3 or so, but we can always come out here to this log and get all of them so that we can get them all corrected and then just go resubmit once. And this just simply shows what we sent to them, what the request was, and what was sent back as the server response. And so if we look at this particular one, here's that error message again that was displayed for us. Again, it was just one error message for the state being W instead of WA. And so we would go through all of this list of problems, get them all corrected, and then go transmit our batch again. So with the report writer, you have the ability to create pretty much any kind of report that you might need. The software has, of course, a wide variety of reports that you can run for pretty much any purpose. We have several different formats, and we've already seen how you can use the advanced reporting to customize it for your needs. With all of those features, the need for the report writer has really gone down. Generally, we'll just start with any one of the out-of-the-box reports and modify it using the advanced features for pretty much just about any report that you might need. If the report that you need is a little bit more complex or a little bit more out of the ordinary, then we might definitely use the report writer to help you create that report. It does get very technical in nature, so I'm going to try and keep this very basic today and show you a basic example of how you can use this. But generally speaking, beyond this, you would be probably calling technical support to get our help in setting it up. You will see that there are lots of features and options involved in it, and knowing how to use those could be a little bit more complex. The example that we'll set up today in the report writer is actually going to be obviously a report that you could create just using a contract balance report, because we're simply just going to create a report that lists the contract balances or the principal balance for the contract. And so, but this will demonstrate kind of all the features of this report writer and show you, what kind of options might be available out there for you if you need a special report. So like any data entry window, again, we press the new button to start a new entry. And we will call this the Principal for principal balance. And then the next thing that we need to do is choose our files. And so for the files, you can choose any of the database tables within the software. Again, we can press the F2 or find to choose from our list. I will put in a search criteria up here on top to narrow down our list. And today we'll be pulling from the loan file, the loan balance file, because we're looking for the principal balance. And then we also want their name, so we'll pull in the contract name database. Again, knowing which databases you might need does become a little bit more technical in nature. The descriptions are somewhat helpful depending on what you're looking for. You can probably find them based on that description. We'll go ahead and say OK to that, and that will fill in that list of files for us in the files list. What will happen automatically next is that the software will create relationships between these 3 database tables. In order to come up with a report that ties this information together, there needs to be an appropriate relationship between these 3 database tables. And so as soon as I try to leave that files field, it's going to give me this message: do you want the system to create them automatically? Generally, we recommend just saying yes to this, and the software will create those relationships for us. And so you don't need to know how to create those. or what they would look like. You just need to trust the software to set them up. However, the software may create some extra ones generally. And so what you may need to do next is click on your relationships list and take a look at the relationships that it did set up. We don't need to relate the begin date to the begin date, so we can delete that filter, or that relationship, rather, and get rid of that one just by deleting it out of the edit box down there. We also don't need this relationship either. And so again, this may not be something that you know. Again, this is something that you might need help with technical support. So we're just going to delete that relationship as well. And now we just have these two relationships that tie these three tables together. And so we've got the loan file connected to the loan balance file and the loan file connected to the loan name file. The next thing that you're going to be setting up are your field expressions. And so this is going to be the list of the columns that are going to be appearing on the report that you're trying to create. And to help you out with the syntax for calling these fields from the database, you can press F2 and it will give you a list of all of the database fields that are in the files that you selected. And so you selected these three files, and so here's the complete list of all of the database fields that are in those three files, as well as some of the UDF files that you might want to tie in as well as some functions, current balance and so forth, that might be appropriate for pulling information or doing some calculations in particular. So what we're going to do first is we want the portfolio ID first on this report. So I'm going to select the loan.folio ID. I'm going to give that a heading as appropriate for the portfolio ID. And then down arrow on my keyboard to add a new record to the grid, and F2 again and choose the loan ID. So scroll down a little bit. They are alphabetized by the field name. Put in the loan ID and put the caption on that as the contract ID. Down arrow yet again, and then we want to pull their name. So I'm going to put in the loan name field, which is loan_nm.name. And again, for the heading on that, name will be fine. And then finally, to pull in procedures, as you saw, if I F2, you get a list of procedures as well. But you've also got the list in your procedures chapter of your manual, which is an appendix. Again, we looked at these yesterday. There's a procedure to calculate what the current principal balance is. And so I'm simply going to copy that filter or that procedure and put it in as a field. There we go. And I'm also going to designate the database table that comes from, which is loan.loanID, so that we designate that. And we're going to call this, we'll just call it balance. And I'm going to go ahead and also check the checkbox for that final one because it is numeric and I'd like to do a total on that column. I'm going to check that checkbox. And at this point, we've done our required fields for this window, so I can go ahead and press save. And now we've saved this report. But the next thing we're going to want to do is probably set up some filters so that we designate what records are showing up and which aren't. If I go ahead and preview this report as it currently stands, we'll see, let me also change the font to a bigger size because that's a little small. I think that should be okay. We'll save that and preview. So there's a slightly bigger font that might be a little bit more legible. You're seeing we're getting a number of things here in this report. We're getting contracts repeated because the name repeats, and so we get each name twice. We've also got some with a zero balance that are showing up still on this report. And they're not in order. They're all out of sequence over here as far as the portfolio ID. So there's probably a lot of cleanup that we're going to want to do on this to really get a report that makes sense. This figure, it really doesn't mean anything because names are repeated with the same balance up here twice. So what I will do is we'll add some filters and clean up this report. So To add a filter, we press the Add button under Filters. I'd get the same thing if I hit the Filters button because I don't have any filters on file yet. And it asks me to choose one of my files, and then it asks me to choose one of my fields to filter on, and then choose an operation, equals or not equals, or greater than or less than for numeric values. And then that takes me down to my edit field down here with the information in it that I already selected. This just really gets you started with a filter and is kind of a way to easily create filters even though you may not know much of the syntax for programming the filter. So in some cases you'll be just plugging in a value here between the quote marks where the cursor is flashing. Other times you might be doing something a little bit more extensive. In this first case, we want to get rid of, well, actually, first let's just do certain portfolios. So we want to do just portfolio 001 and 003. We're not concerned about the other portfolio 002. So what we need to do is actually jump back to the beginning of this filter and plug in a command, which is going to be enlist all trim, which will give us any portfolio IDs that are in the list that we designate. And so we're going to put in our list 001 and 003. Close that, and then get rid of the rest of this filter. Again, somewhat technical in nature. Go ahead and press Enter or Tab, and I may have. And it blanks out your edit box and adds that to your filters list. And so if I click on this filters list, we'll see the one filter that we've added so far. We're going to add a couple more, so I'll press the Add button. This time I'm going to choose the lone name file, and I'm going to choose the order because we only want each name once. And so, or each contract ID once, even if they've got multiple names listed for their particular contract. And so we'll only pull the primary borrower, which is the one listed first, or that has an order equal to 1. And we'll add one more filter, and that's going to be actually on, let me see if it'll let me do that. No, it won't. There we go. So my final filter here is going to be those that have a principal balance greater than 0, so that we suppress everybody that's, there we go, whoa. So greater than 0 is going to be our filter, so that again everybody with a principal balance that's paid off won't show up on this report. So there's our principal balance greater than 0. So now we've got 3 filters, one on the name, one on the principal balance greater than 0, and then the third limiting which portfolio IDs we're running this on. At this point, again, I will stop and save changes. And then if we preview this report, there's results, trust me. There we go. We get a refined list. And so now each name is only appearing there once, and the ones with a 0 balance have been removed. There's our before, and here's our after on this side. What I will do now is we'll make this one go away. This is going to become our before, and we'll go fix the next item, which is going to be our order. So if we go back to contract collector, close this, the next option down here is our order by, and we can click on that, and it's going to give us a list of each of the fields that we set up to be on this report. We do have to sort by one of the fields that is printing. So in this case, we can choose to sort first by the portfolio ID and then by the principal balance, so that they will be in order first by the portfolio ID and then by the principal balance in descending order that way. So if I go ahead and save that change and then preview those results, you'll now notice that they are in order by that portfolio ID. There's our before and there's our after with the portfolio IDs being in order. Once again, we will now make this one the before. And the next thing that we will talk about are the data grouping options. Actually, the data grouping options are really exactly the same as the subtotal options. If I choose either one of these two buttons, I'm going to get the same list to choose for my grouping. The reason why there's two different options is because if you're not doing any subtotals, then there still might be a reason why you'd want to do some data grouping so that you could page break on the portfolio ID, for example. And so if you wanted to do a page break by portfolio ID, I could then choose that option, press preview. Now I've got a two-page report. There's portfolio 1 on the first page. There's portfolio 2, or portfolio 3 on the second page because we're just doing those two portfolios. If you are doing subtotals, then the subtotals button is available. Again, both are the same. If I choose that, you can see that we've already selected the portfolio ID as the grouping. You don't have to page break by portfolio, so I'm going to turn that back off, and we'll again save those changes. But if I now preview this report with the checkbox checked and on one page, you'll notice that we get now a subtotal for each of the two portfolios. So to compare that, just real quickly side by side, there is our before and after. Portfolios are in order, and there's a total for each of the two different portfolios. Really at that point, that covers most of the buttons except this group by button, as well as the test button. What the test button will do is the test button just brings up, instead of previewing the report, it's kind of the same thing. It brings it up to the monitor. It doesn't do any of your formatting, but it will make sure all of your calculations do work out. And so if you had any errors up here that it couldn't resolve, we would have gotten an error message with that test button that allowed us to go check it out. You get the same thing with the preview, so it's kind of the same thing in just a different format. Let's talk a little bit about the group by button. Where that comes into play is only if you have an aggregate function up on your top field list. An aggregate function is something like a sum or a count, where you want to total a bunch of records for whatever you're grouping by. And so, or whatever maybe you're not grouping by. So just as an example, I'm going to set up a new report here, and we're going to call it p-count for just a portfolio count or portfolio totals. And instead of going through setting up a whole bunch of files again in fields, I can go ahead and just use the copy report option, and I will choose that principal balance to copy from. And so if you're creating lots of reports that are kind of the same, you can save yourself a lot of setup and setting up filters, etc. by doing this. So now I've copied that entire setup. All my filters, my relationships, data grouping was all copied over. I'm going to go ahead and change one of the filters, and we will remove this so we do all three portfolios instead of just those two. And I'm also going to, in this case, remove the data grouping so that we're not grouping on the portfolio. And we're going to add some aggregate functions. And so the two that I will use, or actually I'll use three of them in this example, is to sum on this principal balance. And so we're going to take out, because we're going to be combining all of the loans for a portfolio into one record, I'm going to go ahead and remove this row number 2 here with the delete option. Delete row 2, yes. And I'm also going to change this name option since they're going to be combined together and name isn't going to make sense. And actually, I'm going to copy this one if it will let me. Here, we're going to change this one to being the interest balance, which the function is int_bal. And again, we're going to do an aggregate on that. I'm going to sum them all up for all of the portfolios in that group. And then we're also going to add the sum on the principal balance to add those up as well. We are going to change the caption here, the heading, to interest, and we will sum that line, and we'll change this to principal. And let's also add another aggregate function for the number of contracts in each of these portfolios, which is count, and we'll just call that count. And we'll total that one as well. So at this point, I will save this report that we've created. And now, as soon as we added those aggregate functions to our field list up here, you'll notice the group by button down here became available for us. And so the group by button just allows us to select how we want to sum these up together. And so we're going to sum them up together on the portfolio ID. That will take all the portfolio IDs that match and add up all of the contracts in each of those portfolios. So that's the only group by filter we need. Again, I'll save that and preview. And so what we get now is a listing of each of our portfolios, the grand total for interest, principal, and the number of contracts in each of those portfolios. You do have a few other options available to you. We looked already at the font and font size. Again, that just changes what's on the report, your page orientation. We've discussed this already with the portrait or landscape layout. You can designate the descriptions that you want to use, which will be in the upper right-hand corner of the report, so that you can just identify what the report is for or what filters are being used. And so we can say balance greater than 0, anything that you wanted to put to identify this report. And then those would be saved along with the report, and when you preview, they're going to show up in that upper left-hand corner there for you. And finally, another thing that you can do involves this date range option. To demonstrate, for example, we can go back to the one that we were creating initially. And I'm going to add a new column to this report, and that's going to be the loan begin date. And we'll just call this begin date. And again, I'll save those changes. And to preview this report, you'll see this comes up then with each of the appropriate begin dates for the contract. I can then add a filter. And again, I just select something here to get us down to our filter line, and then we'll end up erasing the whole thing. And the filter we'll put in is going to be all the date range that fall between the date range that we specify up above in the date range field. So again, following appropriate syntax, and then accessing those two dates with a command called this form to access those dates that are being used up above. The begin date and the end date. That should allow us to save a filter. We'll save those changes. We can again go back and look at our filters. That's been added to our list. That way, anytime that we come back to run this report, we simply just need to specify what date range we now want to run it for. And we don't have to specifically edit any of our filters. And so I can choose, let's just see contracts that began in 2012. And preview this report. And so now we're only getting the ones that have a begin date in 2012 on this report. Whenever I come back to run it again, I don't need to edit any of the filters. Simply bring up the report under Report Writer, select which report that you want to run, the principal balance report, designate a date range, and preview the report. Oops. There we Again, feel free to contact us at technical support, and we can probably save you a lot of time in setting up these reports. But feel free to do it yourself. You really can't hurt anything, so. All right, tips and tricks. In this section, we're going to cover just a bunch of random items. Unfortunately, we've spoiled most of these for you already. You'll see that we've kind of brought up a lot of these in other sections and have spoiled most of these tips and tricks. But some of these will be a little bit new, so bear with us, and we will cover some functions that might be useful for your operation of the software. So you may have noticed that you can certainly use the keyboard to navigate the user interface, and as you tab, you'll move on to each field one at a time. But as soon as you reach a grid, you kind of become stuck. You'll just go around and around and around in that grid with your tab. You don't necessarily have to grab your mouse to get out of that. If you use your F4 key on your keyboard, that will automatically tab you out of any grid and move you on to your next field. It's a little thing, but if you are a keyboard user and don't like using your mouse, it may speed up some things for you. The next tip and trick that we'll talk about is one that we have looked at before, at least briefly, and that's the ability to drill down on this last payment amount. The upper right-hand corner here shows you how much the last payment amount was for, when it was paid and what payment number it applied to, or at least the largest payment number. If it did a breakdown to multiple payment numbers, it's going to show the largest payment number here. If you need to get more information about what was involved in that last payment, particularly if it was several $1,000s and probably involved, it was a past due payment that involved multiple different payments, and they're now wondering, well, I paid you $10,000 last month. You're telling me I still owe you more money? Well, what did I pay last month? Well, you can bring up this window to show you exactly how that payment applied that they paid last month, or the last payment that they paid, and how that broke down pretty easily without having to go through and look through your ledger, which can be more complicated to look at. We've talked at length about the user calendar. It's a great tool to use to assign tasks for your user. They will get a login message when they log in that they have something in the calendar to go look at, and they can certainly use the F6 function as soon as they've logged in to bring up their calendar for today's date and see what they need to address today. So I won't spend any more time on the user calendar. We've also talked at length about file UDFs. It's a really great way of tying files outside of Contract Collector to your records within Contract Collector. And those can be Word documents, Excel documents, or anything. For example, I can go out to my images folder here, and I have this Excel spreadsheet, and I can save that to this vendor record, and this is a time card. So if this vendor is working for me, maybe they're a lawyer or an accountant, and I'm wanting to track, what kind of things they're doing for me, I've created this Excel spreadsheet, time card type of thing to connect to that record. Maybe the vendor's a handyman or something like that, and you're tracking their hours in Excel spreadsheets. You can tie that directly to their record using your double-click option to access that file directly from within Contract Collector. Image documents, again, we've discussed this already, but if you bring up any of your contracts, your Images tab can have both PDF files and images, and again, you can access these directly with your double mouse click drill down to access these files, whether it's a PDF or a image file. Disabled fields, there's quite a number of places throughout the software where we've protected fields that we don't want you to necessarily change, particularly change accidentally. And so the next payment date and next payment number have been protected. As soon as they've made their first payment, we disable these fields so that they can't be changed. We've already seen that you can do your double left mouse click on this to edit this date if you need to. And so in a lot of cases, if the field is disabled, you can double click on the caption to the left, and it will either bring up a dialog box like this for you to make your change, or in some cases, it will just enable the field immediately to the right so that you can make your change. We can change them from now on. Payments are going to be due on the 15th. Save that change, and in this case, starting in August, his payments are going to be due on the 15th and not the 1st. You're also going to see that with the late fee date. There may be some reason why maybe you accidentally deleted a late fee and now you want to charge them that again, and you want AutoCharge to create it for you. You don't want to create it manually for whatever reason. Or we need to just manipulate this date. We're not going to charge them a late fee on July 6th. And so we can go ahead and just make sure that the software come July 6th doesn't charge them a late fee. We can just advance this to August 6th, save that change. Now, come July, we don't have to worry about whether there'll be a charge to late fee or not. We've advanced it for them, and we've saved that change, and so now they won't be charged that late fee until August. And so not every protected field has that capability. You'll notice if I click on some of these, I'm not allowed access to the field, and some that I am. It just depends on the field and what the purpose is for that field. Keyboard shortcuts, again, if you're a keyboard shortcut person and like to just stick with the keyboard, pretty much everything that you would need the mouse for can be done with the keyboard itself. We do list those keyboard shortcuts up in our menus, and so in our file menu, many of the functions like Control F, Control S for saving records. If you want to do navigation, you've got your Alt arrow keys to do navigation within each of the data entry windows. And those are listed in the menus again for your convenience if you forget what they are and want to find out. We've already talked lots and lots about your right-click shortcut menus, particularly in the contract window with the extended right mouse click options. They're there for your convenience for things like the payment entry window and the statement of payments that you're going to be running specifically for one contract while you're working with that one contract in the contract window. Another thing that we haven't really talked about is the sorting order. So you've noticed that as we bring up each of these data entry windows, it defaults to being sorted by the contract ID, and it brings you up to the last one as sorted by that ID. And so whatever the one alphanumerically is the last one that you would see printed on a report is going to be the last one that it brings up in the window. It's not necessarily the last one that you entered, but it's the last one as sorted by that ID field. If you were going through these, maybe it'd be better if your navigation buttons were working off of the sort name instead of the contract ID. So you can put your cursor down in the sort name field, press your sort button up on your toolbar. Now we're sorting by this name field. As I scroll through these, they're all sorted by that name field. Again, not every field on this screen can you sort by. In fact, most are ones that you can't sort by. And if you were to try to, for example, sort by the tax ID, it's going to tell you that it's not available. Index is not available on this field. You'll see it brings that up in your passive message in the upper right-hand corner. But a lot of things are. So if you want to sort by status and just see your ones that have a certain status, particularly if you're looking at just legal ones or maybe just ones that are in bankrupt or foreclosure, or if you just want to see all of your open ones together and want to filter out all the closed ones, you can sort by, whoops, wrong button, sort by the status field and then scroll through them as sorted by that status field. You can sort by the contract type, see all of the contracts that are mortgage and all of the loans that are auto loans all together. And finally, last but not least, is the tip of the day. Tip of the day may come up automatically when you launch the software if that's one of your preferences in your user preference window. You can access it through your help. We try to update these tips as much as possible with helpful information about using the software, something that you might not have known or been aware of about the software. You can preview or print this list, if you want to post it by your monitor, just to have a complete list of everything and not necessarily read a new tip every day, just up to you. It's not a big thing again, but something that might be helpful. And that is the end of the last section. Any questions on tips and tricks or anything else in general? All right. I appreciate you coming today. It's been great, and look forward to talking to you more on the phone. As you have questions, feel free to call me. So there are numerous security features integrated into Contract Collector that will allow you to both control what happens within the software and also audit what has already happened in the software, just for your tracking purposes. And worst case scenario, if legal proceedings are necessary, this will give you an audit trail that you can use if you do need to pursue any of your employees that have maybe done something that they shouldn't have. So when you first launch the software, as you've seen, you're presented with a login screen. Every user that's using the software will have a unique login to access the software. Those user logins are set up under your user window, which is under your system setup menu. And this user window is one of the first things that you do in the initial setup sequence. You'll also do it at any point in time when you add a new employee that will be using the software. This screen will bring up their information, and it includes basically their user ID, their name, and a password. And this information is required for them to log in, and this window will also keep track of when they last logged in. And we have an audit log that keeps track of most of the major items that they might be doing within the software to track what they're doing. We recommend that you never delete a user ID from the user window. You do have the ability to delete them, just like any data entry window record, they can be deleted. But we recommend that if you do have employees that are no longer with you, you want to prevent them from logging in, instead of deleting the user record, you can use the closed checkbox, which will prevent them from logging in any further. The reason for doing this is that way you still maintain that they have this employee record, this user ID in the software, and we know who it was, so that when we use that audit log, it points back to somebody who still exists. You may want to control what they have access to within the software. For example, somebody whose duty is to just enter payments, they may not need to have access to certain features of the software. And people that are just creating contracts and loans and aren't processing payments probably shouldn't have access to the payment entry window. Somebody whose purpose is just to print checks maybe doesn't need access to anything else. And so that way you can prevent them from doing things within the software that you wouldn't want them to do, or viewing information that they shouldn't see if you do have some sensitive information that you don't want them accessing. So for example, when you switch over to the in the user window, if you switch over to the menu security tab, you will see effectively what is in your menu. And so every menu item is listed here in this grid on the menu security tab, and that will allow you to select what menu items you do not want them to have access to. So for example, we can scroll down to the contract menu, and I'm going to go to user ID Mike, and I'm going to set his contract window security. So that he has read-only access to the contract window. That way he can see the information that's in there, but he won't be allowed to make any changes to the contract records or the loans. Just for sake of example, I'm going to give him gray or no access for the contract reports. What that means is he'll be able to see that that item exists. It will be basically disabled or grayed out, but he won't be able to access any of those items. So he knows that it's there, but he can't access them. The other option, which I will select for the contract notices, is hidden no access, which means he won't even know it's there. which usually might be a better option than just graying it out for him. So I'll go ahead and save those settings. And this user doesn't have a password. And then if I log in as Mike, and we do have some calendar entries for today for Mike. And then go to his contract menu, you will notice that the contract window now indicates that it's read-only, so that he knows that he has only read-only access to the contract menu. And if I select on that, that screen will come up, and you will notice many of the fields are disabled, indicating that you can no longer edit those values. He still has access to look at the contact log and see if there were any calendar entries out there. So access to the calendar, access to the UDF to view the information on the UDFs tab. It's all read-only, but he can see that information, and so he could answer questions about when payments were due and what balances were. He just can't make any changes. And you also notice back in the contract menu, the reports section is still there. It's listed, but it's disabled. He can't open any of those reports. And the contract notices menu item is completely missing. So we'll switch back over here. And so the menu security really allows you the ability to control access to the various aspects of the program. Once these settings have been set up for one user, you can clone them to other users. This allows you the easy ability to set up various levels of access into the program. You can have an administrative user that have access to everything. You can set up a management level that has access, maybe read-only, to certain things, but still is able to view most of the reports. And then you can have different user level accesses, maybe somebody for payroll, maybe somebody for payment input. And if you get a new person that comes in for payment input, you simply clone the old user to the new user for their menu security, so you don't have to keep continually resetting up each of these different settings. And you can view using this sidebar menu. If you just want to view a particular menu item, you can minimize what's in your grid list to do so. Moving on to the next security setting, that's portfolio security. This allows you to designate that they only have access to certain portfolios. And so you may have situations where they only need to be working with certain portfolios. You don't want them to see the other portfolios. And so you can designate that maybe this user only needs access to portfolio 001. And we can save that as part of his security. And then if we switch back over here and see what that looks like for him within the software when he's logged in. And we're logged in over here as Mike again. If we view his find window, you will notice that he's only seeing those in portfolio 001. None of the other portfolios are showing up. If he tried to access something outside of this portfolio, it would just tell him it doesn't exist, and he wouldn't know that it did exist unless he knew otherwise. So this allows you the ability to, again, prevent access and prevent changes to anything that you may not want to have changed. I've also seen this used particularly in remote desktop situations where you're allowing access for your clients, and so you've provided a VPN network or something like that for your investors to log into the software, and you only want them to have access to what they're invested in, and so only their portfolios are they able to view. They can only run reports for their portfolios. They don't know that any other portfolios besides theirs exist. So now that these users are doing things within the software, you may need to at some point track what's happened or who did something, and so we've got a number of tools available to you for tracking that. Under your help menu, there's a system information window, and this system information window contains a lot of useful information. It shows your login list, which is currently who's logged into the software. So you know who's currently working and who's logged in, which may be particularly useful if you have a limit of 5 users to use the software. and somebody else is needing to log in, you need to go see who's logged in and who should be logging out so that this other person can log in. But it also includes this audit trail tab. This audit trail includes anything really major that's happened within the software. Anytime something is deleted, a contract record, a ledger entry, anything that we feel is something that we should flag, we record that entry here in the audit file. And so you can see here there's a relatively short list here within this this demonstration data, but in your case there'd probably be quite a bit longer list here. You can preview or print these lists, and it would bring it up on a report so that you could print it. Again, it's going to be kind of a lengthy list, so that might not be the best way to get this data. We do have another report option that you can use. Under your GL menu, financial statements, we have a general ledger audit report. This contains some things that are not included just in the general audit file. You have the ability to look at what's in the audit file, which is the system audit log checkbox down here, as well as you can look at each journal individually as to the activity that occurred within the adjustments journal, receivables journal, and payables journal window. In this case here, for this example, I'm going to turn off the receivable journal because, as you can imagine, there's quite a bit of activity that happens within there, and I don't need to show you everything. I'm going to change this date as soon as my computer will let me. Just run it for a slightly larger date range so we get a little bit more activity, and then if I preview this report, you'll see, let me make one change to that and make it a little bit easier to read. We have a long entry in there, and so we hit some column wrap. I'll remove some columns quickly, preview that again so it's a little bit easier to read. And it's just showing a list again of the important activity that happened within the software, and it's also showing what user ID performed that activity, and so that you can see who that tracked back to. If it did involve a dollar amount with a ledger entry, that's displayed as well, and what date that happened on. So with that, we have, again, several recommendations for how you can set up security within the software. Again, we kind of recommend having certain levels set up as a default, an administrative level, management level, and then potentially levels for your accounts payable, loan officers that are entering new loans, accounts receivable, and collections. You probably don't need very many. Whatever your office requires is really all you have to set up, and you can set up more as they're needed. Keep in mind, particularly with technical support, if you're calling in, we may need access to certain items that anybody with restricted access may not have access to, and probably generally shouldn't have access to, and so we may need to be able to get into those features, so just prepare for that. Be sure to disable the user window. Otherwise, they'll be able to change their own settings, and they can set their access back to whatever they wish to have. So be sure that if you are minimizing access, that the user window is indeed being restricted. Try to use portfolio security sparingly. It can impact the performance of the software. If you're using it extensively, you may experience some slowdown with the software as it tries to figure out if this is something that it should be displaying or not. If you don't use any portfolio security, then we don't even access that part of the programming, and the program can then run faster. Again, we recommend for any small level user access that you do restrict the system access command window. That is something that technical support may often require access to, but that also allows them access to all of the database files directly, and there's no business logic anywhere within the database structure. And so once you have access to that database, you can really change anything to anything you want it to be, and that allows a lot of flexibility. It also allows a lot of problems if a user gets in there and starts doing things that they shouldn't, and there's no audit file behind that, and so they can delete things and we would never know.